Welcome to episode 59 of No Rares Required, a weekly podcast, and this week will be Rakdos Small Game. So commons and uncommons make up the majority of cards that you will see in a draft, so every week I discuss my strategy to a specific color pair or archetype, and this week Rakdos won the vote. I decided to mix things up last week, and I liked it, so I'm gonna start by going over my draft skeleton before going into the cards specifically, in the order that you'd expect to take them in a draft. So we're actually going to start out with the rares and then kind of end on the commons and uncommons. Excuse me. So Rakdos's theme was Descended, which was sort of like Descend, but when a permanent goes into your graveyard, it triggers Descended, and you're trying to do that as many times as possible was kind of what the design space was for the color pair. And outside of Zoyowa Lava Tongue, I think it's a trap, right? And the archetype's win rate on 17 lands is 52.6% at the time of this recording, which is the lowest of any archetype on 17 lands. So Rakdos has been struggling, but I do think there is a decent strategy if you focus on creating a small game. And that means making your opponent discard, focusing on removal, just trying to make sure that there are few rectangles on the board as possible, at least on your opponent's side, and then try to make yours have a whole bunch. So this draft skeleton is limited to 15 commons, 7 uncommons, and 1 rare. And you can see that it focuses on just that, right? You know, select, choice, removal, cards that make your opponent discard, and then cards that are multiple rectangles in one, like Geological Appraiser or Tali's Favor. And I do think you should try to be mostly black, with red as a secondary color, since most of the undervalued 2-drops that I'm going to try to take advantage of are in black. And as always with black, you want to keep your eyes open for both Deep Cavern Bat and the Chupacabra Echo. Both have been fantastic uncommons. So with that, remember to hit like and subscribe for daily Magic the Gathering content, and come visit YouTube if you want to place your vote for the next archetype. And with that, let's dive into the cards individually. So when I look at analyzing an archetype, what I do first is I like to calculate the total wins created. And I do this by taking the average of games played, the games played win rate, and the games in hand win rate, and then I subtract the average win rate of all users in the archetype, and then multiply it by the number of games played. And this is, I like to do this because it kind of gives you a nice idea of like what are the most commonly played cards that have been doing well, right? And so for those who are audio only, the top of the list is Deep Cavern Bat, followed by Tithing Blade, Geological Appraiser, Volatile Wanderglyph, Chupacabra Echo, Magmatic Galleon, Plundering Pirate, Abrade, Zoyowa Lava Tongue, Bitter Triumph, Natalia's Favor, Echo of Dusk, Trumpeting Carnosaur, Preacher of the Schism, Bonehorde Dracosaur, and Hidden Necropolis. And so similarly, you can do this same process for the total wins destroyed. And that one, the top of the list is Acolyte of Achlazotz, Child of the Volcano, which is the 3/3 hill giant that gets +1/+1 if you descended, right? So I mean, like, both of these cards right here, I think are traps, right? So you should avoid them. Deep Goblin Skull Taker, which is the 2/2 menace that gets a +1/+1 if you descended. So you can see right here that like the cards that are doing the theme of the archetype are the worst performers in the archetype. And that's what I mean by I think it's a trap. Greedy Freebooter, Treasure Map, Vito's Inquisitor, Mephitic Draft, Tarian's Soul Cleaver, Hunter's Blowgun, Volatile Fault, Screaming Phantom, Zoyowa's Justice, and Screaming Phantom is the 2/2 Windrake that whenever it attacks, you trigger a Descend. Broodrage Mycoid, Bat Colony, and Polani's Hatcher, which is the green-red dinosaur for the splash. So I, you know, considering how well Hatcher has performed, I think this shows that you really don't want to be splashing in this Rakdos space. So, but to get to the really good juicy bits, the next part is where I think the value comes from. And so I take those wins created that I calculated and I divide them by the number of times that the card was picked to get the wins per pick, if you will. And then I graph that against the average taken at, or what point in the draft was the card taken at. And I fit the data with a logarithmic regression. And what that allows me to do is calculate the value over replacement, which is the distance that the card was to the fitted line. So, and this was a technique that Carl or 2Duck Cubed used, and I really liked it. So, and what this allows you to do is to see what are the top cards that you should be aiming to take at different time points within a draft. And one of the things that I do want to mention just really quickly, though, is that you can still have a positive wins per pick and be below the dashed line, right? So you would have a negative value over replacement, but you would still be technically a good card. And I mention this because you're going to see specifically two cards that I think are taken very highly that are not going to make it on this list. One is Abrade, and the other one is Join the Dead. And they're both, single point removal has been kind of not as great as it usually is. Now, I'm not saying that it's a bad card. You're not going to be sad that if you have a Join the Dead or an Abrade in your hand. The issue is that where on the average taken at do you have to take the Abrade, and how good is it in your deck, right? And so it doesn't actually, it's below the dashed line. And but you're competing with like, Abrade is gone by pick 3, right? So like you're looking at competing against a list of incredibly strong rares and mythics. So top of the list here we've got the Bone Horde Dracosaur, which is a 5/5 flying first strike for 5 that helps you dig, and then you get to create treasures and 3/1 dinosaur tokens. You've got Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, which is the black bat god that's a 4/4 flying lifelink for 5. That whenever it attacks, your opponents discard. If they can't, you draw a card. If they discard a land, you get to create a 1/1 flying bat creature token, and then it comes back as a land that can transform back into the god if a player has 1 or fewer cards in hand. So I mean, these are just absolutely powerful cards, right? I mean, if we compare these to like Abrade, you can kind of see why it didn't make the list. But Magmatic Galleon, we've got a 5/5 vehicle for 5 that deals 5 damage, and then if something's dealt excess non-combat damage, you create a treasure token, and with crew 2. Preacher of the Schism, 2/4 Death Touch, that when it attacks, you create a 1/1 vampire token if they have more life than you, and then if they have less life than you, you draw a card and lose 1 life, and if you're tied, it does both. Trumpeting Carnosaur, you got a 7/6 Trampler that enters the battlefield and discovers 5 for 6, 4 double pip red. And you've got 2 red, you can discard it from your hand to channel it, use it as an activated ability from your hand to deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. So they can't even counter this unless they have something that counters abilities. You've got Breaches, Eager Pillager, a 3/3 first strike that if the more pirate synergies you have, the better it is. Create a treasure token, target creature can't block, exile the top card of your library. It works even with itself though, because it is a pirate, so you don't need pirates to make it shine. You get Inti, which works particularly well in Rakdos and was kind of the captain of my draft skeleton. Because you get a 2/2 for 2 that whenever you attack, you may discard a card. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. So you can use this to kind of trigger the Descended if that is important to you. But more importantly, it just helps you find your stuff, find your cheap stuff, and continue to overrun your opponent by going wide. Because you get to exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card until your next instep. And then we've got Bloodletter of Aclazot's, which I think works really well in Rakdos as well, because you get a 2/4 flyer that whenever an opponent would lose life during your turn, they lose twice that much life instead. So it basically ups the power of all of your little tiny 1/1s and 2/2s that you're flooding the board, and it makes them hit for 2 damage or 4 damage, right? It doubles their damage. And then since you should be mostly black anyway, the casting cost isn't too bad, right? But the thing that I think is more important than what busted rares should you play comes down to the value over replacement when you're looking at picks, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, onward towards 5. These are the signpost uncommons, and sometimes there's a common in there that is kind of like why you should head into this archetype. And So at the top of the list, we've got Deep Cavern Bat, which is the 1/1 flying lifelink that when it enters the battlefield, you get to look at your opponent's hand. If you remove interaction from them, then they have to spend interaction to get it back. So this has just been a very impressive card, and it's starting to, it's seeing constructed play as well. And we've got Chupacabra Echo, which is a limited all-star. When it enters the battlefield, target creature and opponent controls gets -X/-X, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. And this is one of the very few payoffs in Rakdos to actually doing the Descended thing and getting your graveyard bigger, is that you feed the Chupacabra Echo and make it more likely to be an automatic 2-for-1. Geological Appraiser is a great uncommon and fits very well into what the Rakdos thing is trying to do, which is limit your opponent's resources while maximizing the amount of cards that you have on the battlefield. So the fact that it's 2 cards in 1 works really well. And then we've got Bitter Triumph, which is cheap enough and instant speed. This has worked just a little bit better than the Join the Deads and the Abrades. But you have to either discard a card or pay 3 life. One of the fun things with it, right, is that you can trigger Descended if that was important, right? Most of the time you're just paying 3 life with this, though. And then, not quite last, sorry. Restless Vince is the man land, and, for a rare, this one does tend to go late because the Rakdos space is so bad, right? But all of the man lands are definitely playable. Being able to improve your 24th card from a land into a land that does something is good, and it helps fix. So you get a 2/3, you can activate it for 1 a black and a red to get a 2/3 insect creature with menace, and then whenever it attacks, you may discard a card if you do draw a card. So it fits the Rakdos theme that you should be avoiding, but I still think that this is a reasonable card to pick up. And then we've got Molten Collapse, which you've got the sorcery speed, destroy target creature or planeswalker for a black and a red. And then if you Descended this turn, which you can activate off of your volatile Wanderglyphs and such, right? You get to destroy target non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less as well. So you can snipe a map token or something like that. But cheap removal that if you because of how soon Abrade and Join the Dead get taken, and you have other options that get taken a little bit less. Like Molten Collapse, for example. Like this card, you're not going to take it unless you're in Rakdos or you're rare drafting, right? So that's the thing about the value over replacement is there something in your deck that at a specific pick order could you take that's more valuable, right? Like clearly you can replace these with Join the Dead and Abrades and the deck is largely going to be the same, right? But I thought it was interesting to remark on. Okay, so then we got value over replacement for picks 5 through 8, and we've got the top of the list here, starting things off with the Zoyowa Lava Tongue, which is the 2/2 signpost for Rakdos, and this actually works really well. I think that especially if you're doing the strategy of going wide and having a lot of rectangles, it's not difficult to descend. You can have the volatile Wanderglyphs that trigger descend, and this is definitely one of those things that you want to be descending every single turn if you have Zoyowa in play, because it deals so much damage to your opponent. They have to sacrifice a permanent or discard or take 3 damage, and eventually they just run out of resources, and this starts really adding up. Tithing Blade fits perfectly into the go small game, where you're trying to make sure that your opponent has a limited board, and then if they play a big green creature, you can just play the Tithing Blade to make them sacrifice it. And then it also leaves behind the artifact, which can craft with the creature. I forgot to put this on here, but it turns into the Consuming Sepulture, which for 4 and a black and exiling with a creature, you can turn at the beginning of your upkeep, your opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And if you're just nickeling and diming your opponent, which I think is what this space is doing best, then flipping this is pretty good, and I've been impressed with it. And we've got the Volatile Wanderglyph, which is a 2/2 Grizzly Bear for 1 and a red, that whenever it becomes tapped, you may discard a card if you do draw a card. So this is useful for rummaging through your lands, triggering Descend if you do have Zoyowa, and we've got the Atali's Favor, which is a 2 and a red enchant creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, discover 3. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has trample. I've been most impressed with this in Gruul, where you're giving a big dinosaur that doesn't have trample, giving it trample permanently. But I also, it's just good. It's just been an impressive card. if being able to do kind of the go wide strategy, right? So if you play this, it can whiff. There's a little bit of a random number generator to it, but you can still do some pretty cool stuff with the Tali's Favor. And being able to play, being able to give something +1/+1 and trample, and then also hit a 3-cost creature is just a lot of value if you do high roll on it. And then we've got this Synapse Necromage, which has been relatively unimpressive for an uncommon, but if you're picking it up late, if you're picking it up past pick 5, these do tend to go late because they haven't been really great. And but they do fit a go wide strategy, which you could be doing like Orsov, where you're trying to go for like a board pump. And I think there's a lot of similarities to how Rakdos is doing it. They just don't have the War Scribe to give the +2/+1 to everything. But a 3/1 that then creates 2 more rectangles works well in the small game. And then we've got the Visage of Dread, which is an artifact for 1 and a black. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an artifact or creature from it. That player discards that card. And I think Visage of the Dread is best in Rakdos because of you have a lot of these cheap creatures. Sometimes, like if I end up in like Dimir, sometimes in like Golgari decks, I actually don't want to be crafting with my graveyard because it goes against Descend. So a lot of times in black, I want my graveyard to have as many permanents as possible. But in this one, there isn't really anything outside of the Chupacabra Echo that is giving a lot of perks to having a big graveyard. So this is a nice place for that, especially if you are making them discard cards and removing their board. Turning into a 5/4 Menace, if they don't have a lot of creatures, is a really good way to pressure your opponent. And then you don't have to mill. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may mill 2 cards. And again, because I don't really care about the graveyard, you don't need to do that unless you're interested in triggering Descended for your Zoyowa. And then Skullcap Snail is kind of like the unsung hero of black, and especially in combination with another chance where you can play this, get chump block with it, get it back into the graveyard, and then play it again. I had one deck in Golgari that was running one snail, and I think I played that snail 3 times in one game, right? And if you're just this is how you enable. This is one of the great enablers for making it into a small game. And I think that people have started to value the Skullcap Snail a little bit more highly, and I suggest you do the same. Then there's the Plundering Pirate. You get a 3/2 for 3 that when it enters the battlefield creates a treasure token. This one is also good just for the mana fixing, because if let's say that you're running Join the Dead, for example, or Chupacabra Echo and the Appraiser, right? It's not uncommon to have double pips in both black and red, and so this helps you fix that with the treasure token. And then we've got the Deathcap Marionette, which is a 1/1 Death Toucher for 2 that when it enters the battlefield you may mill 2 cards. So this one triggers the Descend if they care about that. Otherwise, you can skip the mill. And then we've got the Dino Tomaton, also called Tomato, which is a 4/3 Menace for 4 that when it enters the battlefield, target creature you control gains Menace until end of turn. And Menace works really well in the small game, right? The smaller your opponent's board, the more likely that you're going to be able to just go wide. And they can't afford to multiple block the Menace creatures. And then we've got Saheeli's Lattice, which you can enter when it enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. And so it does trigger your Zoyowa. It helps you discard a land and draw 2 later in the game. And then if you do have some of your tomatoes, you can craft them into a dinosaur. It's not spectacular, but it's decent enough to include. And then we've got the Defossilize, which works terribly in this compared to other archetypes. So if you have a Defossilize, you're going to want to try to include a little bit bigger beef. And of course, I should mention this. You can do multiple strategies, right? I mean, I'm just suggesting the one that I think the stats suggest has your best chance, right? But you don't need to, right? And if you're picking up a bunch of these cards that are good at milling, like the Marionettes, you can put in some big stuff to animate with Defossilize. My draft skeleton it had like 2 cards that cost more than 4, right? Like ultra low curve. And so if you do pick up the Defossilize, then you're going to want to tweak your strategy a little bit. But it's a viable strategy anytime that you're in black, because a lot of the mill enablers are already in black. And then we've got Dead Weight, -2/-2 while giving you a permanent that triggers your Descended. I thought was going to be just like a superstar in Rakdos. It's pretty good if you are up against the right colors. If you're up against like rural dinosaurs, then this can kind of struggle to find a good target. But it's the fact that it goes reasonably late is makes it into like I'm never passing a dead weight, right? Whenever I will pass a dead weight if it's like pick 3 or something, right? But it's been impressive removal. And then we have Digsite Conservator, which is a 2/1 for 2 colorless. This is the only archetype that I think you should run the Digsite Conservator, just because it is doing what I want to be doing with my Rakdos deck, which is when this dies, if I have 4 mana, I can discover 4 and it hits my entire deck, right? And then you can use it in a pinch if you're up against another Descended deck that cares about the permanents in their graveyard. You can sacrifice it to exile up to 4 target creature cards or target cards from a single graveyard. Activate only as a sorcery. So it can be useful in some games, and but most of the time you're just really wanting to get the Discover off of this so that you can continue to go wide and slam your stuff into your opponents, and you don't care if there are casualties, because there should only be one thing that's getting traded off and the rest get through, right? So that's kind of the idea. And to wrap things up, we've got the value over replacement for picks 8 and onward. And these are the cards that you can take advantage of being available on the wheel. And there are a couple that are definitely good cards that I think one of the advantages to black is that currently Jeskai is incredibly overdrafted. So if I do the same calculations for Izzet and Azorius, the value over replacement for picks 8 and onward is empty. There are no cards that you expect to wheel for Boros, for Azorius, or for Izzet. And so black has this, it has more of that space of like what you usually get to see, which is there are some stuff that you can plan to wheel. Top of the list is Hidden Necropolis, which is the black cave land that can tap for 4 and a black to discover 4. Echo of Dusk, which is a 2/2 that if you have 4 permanents in your graveyard, it gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. Fanatical Offering, which as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, draw 2 cards, and create a map token. Works really well. The cheaper your curve is, the more fodder that you have. You've got Another Chance, which I really, I think that Another Chance actually works better with the cheap black 2-drops than it does with getting back a big threat, right? It really depends on the timing of the deck that you're trying to run. But getting back your Spike Tail, and then you can't play Another Chance and play your Spike Tail, right? Like you have to offset it. But if you have 5 mana, you can play Another Chance and like play a snail, right? And that's where I think it's really been the most impressive to me. Or a little bit of both, right? You get back your Spike Tail and you get back a snail. The fact that these are also starting to get picked up a little bit sooner. Another Chances, I've just recently been exploring the black space a little bit more, and you have those moments where you're like, well, do I try to wheel the Another Chance? And sometimes the Another Chances are just wide open. Other times there's other black drafters, and these have started to disappear. So we'll be curious to see in the next little bit if the average taken at for the Another Chance starts to shift. And then we've got the Calamitous Cave-In, and this is a remark just in general about caves, and Calamitous Cave-In, Bat Colony, and the Sinuous Benthesaur are really your biggest cave payoffs, and they all require a different amount of caves in your deck to really make it work, right? I think the Benthesaur is the lowest, because even if you have 1 cave by turn 6, then it's at least a draw on a 4/4 for 6, which is not spectacular. But like Bat Colony, you need to have like 9 or 10 caves, right? You need to have a large amount of caves. Calamitous Cave-In is best if you can hit around 3 or 4. If you deal 4 damage to the board for 4, I've been reasonably impressed with it, which does require a pretty high cave count. So, I haven't done the exact calculation for the Calamitous Cave-In, but every time that I've been playing it, I have 8 or more, and it's worked relatively well. So, and that's kind of you can pick up the Hidden Volcanoes as well. And then if you happen to have a bat colony, you can pick up the white cave. If you happen to have a sinuous Binthasar, you can hit the blue. So anytime that you're in black, keep caves open as a potential option. And then we've got the Panicked Altasaur, which is a 4/5 for 5 with reach, and when it can tap to deal 2 damage to each opponent. And this one works relatively well as a finisher. If if you are going to sneak in just a little bit more into your top end, the fact that if the board does eventually get gummed up and you're unable to get your damage through, then Panicked Altasaur can just be a good defensive blocker, and then ping them at the end of their turn for 2 damage. So I think that the fact that this is available on the wheel too, I know some people who are actively happy to pick up Panicked Altasaurs much sooner than the wheel. But I do think you should try to pick them up on the wheel if you can, just to try to maximize the value, which is, if you're going to end up in the worst archetype statistically on 17 lands, you probably are doing it for some reason. And one of them, I think, is to try to maximize the value out of your 8 picks, your pick 8s and onward. Because unlike Golgari, which I feel like is a very underdrafted space, a lot of the red cards are kind of highly sought after, right? And so like you're really going to have to fight hard to get those abrades and such, right? So like, why do you end up in red as opposed to green? Well, maybe you opened up one of those busted red rares in pack 1 pick 1, and then black was open, right? But anyway, the last card is Captivating Cave, and this one is just, it's the same thing as like the Hidden Necropolis and the Hidden Volcano. This one is a nice cave to pick up if you are especially trying to do the Calamitous Cave-In kind of wrath your opponent's board, which can definitely catch your opponent off guard. And still, even this far into the set, I've just recently I played a Caves deck that was so beautiful. It had it was Throne of the Grim Captain, but also running caves. Like it was doing everything, and I was so happy. But I hit everything on the board for like 7 damage with a Calamitous Cave-In, and I was running 10 caves, or 9. And yeah, it's just, caves can be a really fun time. So next week I'll be covering another archetype. So if you have one that you'd like to see, let me know by voting on the poll on YouTube. It does take a fair amount of time to put these presentations together. So if you found this episode helpful, please take the time to hit like and subscribe and leave a comment. I really appreciate it. And you can also go above and beyond and become my first YouTube member by clicking join, or subscribing on my Patreon. Give you shout outs in the credits and, my undying love. And thank you for watching to the end of the video. Good luck with your games and future trophies. Thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.